everyone. I'm Brandy, an OpenSciEd teacher and professional learning facilitator. Welcome to OpenSciEd Chemistry, Unit 1, Lesson 8. This is an important lesson where our students will focus on what the indigenous knowledge they can learn from the Inuit about how the conditions have changed over time. And they'll also investigate the data that's generated by NASA's Oceans Melting Greenlands project. Let's take a look at how we got here. So during lesson 7, we discussed who should decide whether microbeads should be used to slow polar ice melt, and we read about feedback loops. We figured out the differences between positive and negative feedback loops. And through the mid-unit assessment, we figured out that one feedback loop is thawing permafrost, releasing carbon dioxide, which causes additional warming and permafrost thaw. So in this lesson, we're wondering how the berm solution actually works. What is going on where the Ilulissat Glacier meets the ocean water? Here's the lesson at a glance. This is a one-day lesson where the students will be investigating and problematizing to set up the second lesson set. There are 2 related videos, an optional one about Inuit beliefs, and the other about collecting ocean water data with the NASA OMG project. This lesson can be broken up into 2 sense-making loops. In the first loop is where OpenSciEd incorporates the indigenous knowledge as part of its commitment to equity, inclusion, and cultural relevance in science education. The curriculum is designed to connect scientific concepts to the students' lived experiences and their diverse backgrounds, making sure that all of the students see themselves and their communities as valuable contributors to science. So first we discuss the ethics of engaging with indigenous knowledge according to the Inuit Circumpolar Council guidelines. We figure out that people pass on what they know to their children over many generations. We hear from the Inuit hunters and the fishers about the sea and the ice conditions and animals in the circumpolar region have changed over time. And we wonder where the glacier melt's occurring. The Inuit think that it's coming from the ocean or the bay. In the second loop, we review the data that's collected from NASA's Oceans Melting Greenland, or OMG, project from the water that's near the Ilulissat Glacier. We figure out that the NASA OMG scientists' data shows that most of the melting is occurring at the bottom of the glacier where the water is the warmest. And we realize that both the berm solution and cutting carbon emissions could slow the transfer of energy to the glacier. We're puzzled by that the warmest water is at the bottom of the bay, and we decide that we need to figure out why the warm water that's salty stinks. So we figured out that some of the questions are best answered through field-based investigations and experience, and through indigenous knowledge, we know that people can pass on what they know to their children over many generations. We heard from the Inuit hunters and fishers about how the sea ice and the conditions and animals in the circumpolar region have changed over time. We also figured out that both the berm solution and cutting carbon emissions can slow the energy transfer between the warm ocean water and the glacial ice, but they do so with different mechanisms and different timescales. We're wondering why the warmest ocean water is at the bottom of the bay. And now for some key moments. The first key moment is in part 2. So in part 2, I revisit my community agreements to frame the upcoming discussion, focusing my students on being respectful. And then I discuss the ethics of engaging with indigenous knowledge by introducing my students to the Inuit Circumpolar Council, or the ICC, and their guidelines. And I show a portion of the Inuit Belief Highlights video. It's really important not to skip this part because the key takeaway here is how the hunters and the fishers define inputs and outputs and where they think the glacier melt is occurring. In part 3, the key moment is where we are introduced to the NASA OMG, or Oceans Melting Greenland project. And we watch a video that's explaining how the NASA scientists collect their data. I help my students analyze the data that they're collecting in the OMG project. And my students figure out that most of the melting is happening at the bottom of the glacier where the water is the warmest. This is really important because it reinforces what the Inuit are also saying about where the glaciers are melting and how they are changing. So, where do we go from here? By this point, we know that the warmer water is at the bottom, and that is where the glaciers seem to be melting. And we're wondering, why is the warm water there? So, in the next lesson, we will investigate mass and volume of water that is different temperatures, and if it's salty or fresh, and that's going to help us to figure out why that warm, salty water sinks. And now here's a few tips and tricks. In part 2 of the teacher edition, it talks about inviting the students to read the ICC's protocols for equitable and ethical engagement. Well, the links in the material preparation section and the link in the learning plan for part 2, they're both broken. But all I had to do was put in the title of the document, and it took me to this page where I could download the PDF that I could share with my students. The teacher's edition also says that the Inuit Belief Highlights video is optional, but it's already built into the slide deck. And I chose to show it to my students so they could actually see and hear the Inuit themselves and hopefully make the situation more real to them. I always want to make sure to turn on the closed captioning to help my students understand what the hunters and the fishers are saying, because they have accents that can sometimes make it difficult to understand. And if you use the link that's in the slide deck, the video is already queued up to begin at 8 minutes and 26 seconds. So you can just play the end portion of the video. And now for some tips in part 3. Color really helps. If you print the NASA OMG project handout in color, do it if you can. The map on the left has a lot of detailed information, and my students got a little overwhelmed, so I projected it and I walked them through the key. I couldn't print it in color, so projecting it helped, and they don't really need to get hung up on all of the specifics in the map. For the glacier profiles that are on the right, we talked about the water temperature scale. And I had my students use blue and red colored pencils to mark up their copy because I had to print it in black and white. It's really important that they pick up the pattern on where the warm water is and where the cool water is. All of these words are introduced in part 2, where we talk about the Inuit and we describe the system's inputs and outputs, such as the hunters and the fishers interacting with the sea and the ice and the sky and the new fish and the birds and the insects that they're now seeing. We visit these words again when we're comparing how the NASA OMG scientists describe the system inputs and outputs as only being the things that their instruments can pick up, such as temperature or salinity. For poster management, you'll want to have a couple of anchor charts available from previous units. You'll need the driving question board and the class consensus model from lesson 5. There's no new posters that are created during this lesson. Okay, so to recap, in this lesson, students focused on the indigenous knowledge that they could learn from the Inuit and how the conditions have changed over time. They also investigated the data that was generated by the NASA Oceans Melting Greenland project. Up next in lesson 9 is where the students will learn about density and why the warm, salty water sinks and melts the glaciers. Good luck and have fun.